Okay, so now we're moving on to part two, which is going to be transmission lines. We're pretty much going to talk about nerves, what is a nerve, and also if they have the ability to be repaired, how we actually go in and repair them. So this is section 3 in your textbook. So what is a nerve? Basically, it's just a cord-like organ. It's part of our peripheral nervous system. And when we're talking about nerves, they can either be classified as cranial or spinal, depending on where they come from. So if they're cranial, they're going to arise from the brain. If they're spinal, they're going to arise from the spine. All of the nerves that we have in our body are going to vary in size, but a lot of them are basically just going to be bundles of the axons. Some of these can be myelinated and some are not myelinated, and these axons are going to be wrapped in some sort of connective tissue. So kind of like our muscles, we have 3 different membranes that are going to wrap or be part of the nerve itself. We have the endoneurium, and this is going to be the membrane that is going to be associated and wrapped around each individual axon or nerve fiber. And just like muscle cells or muscle fibers, we group axons together in these little groups that are called fascicles, and then each fascicle is going to have its own membrane or connective tissue wrapping, and that's going to be the perineurium. And then finally, around the entire nerve itself is going to be a tough fiber sheath called the epineurium. And this is going to be the one that encloses all of the fascicles and the one that actually forms the nerve itself. Okay, so most nerves are going to be mixtures of both afferent and efferent fibers. And if you remember, we kind of talked a little bit about this before. Afferent fibers are the ones that are sending information from your sensory receptors to your central nervous system. And then some of these nerves are going to be sending information from the central nervous system out to the effector organ itself. So nerves can be classified depending on which direction they're transmitting these impulses. So if we're talking about mixed nerves, they're going to be mixed. So they're going to have both sensory and motor fibers that are transmitting the impulses, which means that they're sending information both to and from the central nervous system. If we're talking about sensory nerves or afferent nerves, these are solely going to be carrying information towards the central nervous system. And if we're talking about motor or efferent nerves, these are only carrying impulses from the central nervous system to the effector organ themselves. Most of the nerves that we have are actually mixed, so they have both sensory and motor nerves in them. But a couple of nerves do just have purely sensory or purely motor nerves, but those are much less common. So because these mixed nerves can carry both somatic and autonomic fibers in them, they can be classified according to which region they actually innervate. So we have what are called somatic afferent, somatic efferent, visceral afferent, and visceral efferent. So yes, you need to know when we're talking about mixed nerves and you see these 4 particular types, what that means they're carrying information to or from. And if you remember our terms, you should automatically be able to know this. So if we're talking about afferent, remember afferent's approaching ANA. So anything that's afferent is carrying it from some sort of sensory which means it's sending information. Afferent means towards or approaching the central nervous system. Actually, let me change that to approaching. So you have A and A. Approaching central nervous system. Efferent means it's exiting the central nervous system. If we're talking about somatic, remember our somatic motor system is going to be our muscle. So somatic nervous system is our skeletal muscle system. And if we're talking about visceral, and we talked about visceral membranes, like visceral pleura. Visceral just means organ. So our visceral pleura was the one, or visceral membrane was the one that was actually touching the organ themselves. So if we looked at these mixed nerves and we see somatic, we automatically know muscles involved. And it says afferent, which means it's going to be sending information to the central nervous system. So basically from the muscle, that's where somatic came from, to the brain. That's what afferent means. If we look at somatic again, we know muscles involved, but it's efferent. So that means it's taking information from the brain and sending it to the muscle. If we look at visceral, that means organs involved, and it's afferent, so we're sending information from an organ to the brain. If we look at visceral, we have organ again, but it's efferent, which means that we're sending information from the brain to the organs. Other things that we talked about were ganglia. So what are ganglia? They're basically just collections of these cell bodies of the neurons that are associated with the nerves in the peripheral nervous system themselves. So the nerves are basically the bundles of the axons, but we also have bundles or collections of the cell bodies themselves. And the collections of the cell bodies of the neurons are what are called ganglia. We're talking about the peripheral nervous system. So if we're talking about collections of these cell bodies in the central nervous system, those are referred to as nuclei. So that's what we talked about in chapter 12 when we talked about the central nervous system. But now we're in the peripheral nervous system, so we're working with ganglia, which is referring to the cell bodies, and nerves, which is referring to the axons of the neurons themselves. So we have ganglia that can be associated with afferent nerve fibers. These are going to contain the cell bodies of the sensory neurons, because again, we're talking about afferent. We also have ganglia that are associated with efferent nerve fibers, and these are mostly going to contain the cell bodies of the automatic motor neurons themselves. So we'll talk about, again, autonomic ganglia is going to be the component of chapter 14, and we talked a little bit about ganglia in chapter 12. So now we know exactly what a nerve is and what a ganglion is, but what happens if we damage a neuron? Can we regenerate the axon? If you remember the properties of neurons, they are amitotic, which means they cannot undergo mitosis, which means if they die, we cannot generate any more. However, in the event that we maybe just damage part of a peripheral axon, we may be able to go in and repair it. We are again only talking about the peripheral nervous system in this chapter. If we're talking about neurons in the central nervous system, they have zero ability to regenerate their axons if they are damaged. Because basically what happens is that the central nervous system, when we're talking about that, some of the cells go in there and they help prevent regeneration of the axon. When we're talking about the peripheral nervous system, there's cells and things that can go in and help the axon with regrowth if it's not too severe. So again, when we're talking about central nervous system axons, so in our brain or our spinal cord, they can never regenerate. Why? Because those oligodendrocytes, they actually have growth inhibiting proteins that are going to prevent that central nervous system fiber from regenerating following energy. And this is why spinal cord injuries are really, really devastating and can lead to permanent paralysis, because again, central nervous system includes your spinal cord as well. Typically though, for treatment, they are working on new things. So for example, they are trying neutralizing growth inhibitors, blocking receptors for these inhibitory proteins that these oligodendrocytes are secreting, and also helping prevent scar tissue components that are coming from the astrocytes themselves. But a lot of this is still in clinical trials, and they haven't been able to quite figure out how to promote central nervous system axon regeneration yet. In this chapter, though, we're really going to focus on regeneration of axons in the peripheral nervous system. So unlike those in the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system axons, if they are cut or crushed, they can successfully regenerate. And that's what we're going to talk about today. There's 4 basic steps. So if the damage isn't too severe, so the axon fragments in the myelin sheaths in the distal area are going to be able to degenerate. That's called Wallerian degeneration, and this degeneration is going to spread down the length of the axon. I'll show you an image in a second. Obviously, if we have damage to any one of our axons, we're going to have some debris. It could be cell debris, debris from the axon damage itself. So we need some cells to go in there and clean up the debris, and that's going to be accomplished by our macrophages. And then our Schwann cells, remember those are the ones responsible for myelination in the peripheral nervous system. Those are actually going to be able to stimulate division in order to help with regeneration. And then we have our axon filaments in our third step that are actually going to grow through this regeneration tube, again, which I'll show you. And then our axon is going to regenerate, and we finally form our new myelin sheath. So this is just showing you the first picture where we have the axon fragment. We can see in this specific area of the axon we have damage right here. So basically what's going to happen is everything distal, so if this is the box that's blown up right here, distal would mean farther away from the cell body itself. What we're going to do is we're going to have Wallerian degeneration, where we're actually going to start degrading down distally to the site of damage itself. The second step is going to be that our Schwann cells, again, the ones responsible for myelination, they're going to go in along with macrophages and help clean up that entire area that's distal to the site of damage. The third step is allowing the axon filaments to grow through what's called a regeneration tube. If you have damage to several neuron axons themselves, a lot of ability to be able to go in and repair it, they will actually go in and make one of these regeneration tubes to help guide the growth of the neurons. So yes, they can do it on its own, but sometimes neuron growth, as far as regeneration, is haphazard. It's not perfect. So this regeneration tube that we can sometimes do in our own neurons themselves is really helpful for guiding their connection again. But if there's a lot severe damage and you have to have a surgeon go in, they will actually manually insert a regeneration tube to help guide all of these axons to connect together. And the final step is that we have to go in and regenerate the myelin sheath so that now we have completed our repair. I will say, just understand the 4 basic steps of what's going on when we talk about axon regeneration. Also understand that axon regeneration only occurs if our peripheral nervous system neurons are damaged. If we damage the axons in our central nervous system, we absolutely cannot regenerate those axons because we have those inhibiting proteins being released from oligodendrocytes.